Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another ChemCon TV interview. Step right up and prepare to be informed. Today in our studio, it's all about hazards, risks and exposure. For those less familiar with these terminologies, I present our first act, Chimpanzini Bananini. Because this week, every ChemCon TV interview features a cameo from an Italian brain rot character. Where in this case, the banana is the potential hazard. The slipping of the banana is a risk and the clown gets exposed. Whether you're young or simply young at heart, hazard and risks are everywhere. So with a hearty, no guts, no glory, let's welcome our two performers. Henrik Laursen from the European Commission DG Environment and Nicholas Bol from Dow. Thank you. ChemCon is in town. The stage is set, so the interview can begin. Henrik and Nick, why is the topic of hazard and risk assessment relevant today in the context of environmental and industrial policy?
So I can start for this one, Henrik, if you'd like. I think it's always been relevant. It's not new. I think what we're seeing, though, is an increasing desire to understand more about the hazards of the chemicals and things that people interact with, and therefore the risks, and to manage things on that basis to obviously improve the safety, sustainability. So it's not that it's a new thing, but obviously we now see it being much more important, for example, than perhaps just making chemicals for profit. Now we are expected to make sure that those are also safe and sustainable and to innovate in that direction. So it's really a shift in the mindset rather than a change in importance. But now, Henrik, if you would like to add something onto that.
Well, I completely agree that the discussion about hazard and risk or exposure is an evergreen in chemical policy. I think from a regulatory perspective in Europe, we've been focusing on both aspects since a long time, even predating the REACH regulation. Mm-hmm. And I'm very happy to hear that it's now beginning to have a real impact also in the industrial thinking. I think that's where it really belongs.
Perfect. Henrik, could you explain how the European Commission distinguishes between a hazard-based and a risk-based approach in the EU chemicals legislation?
First, I would like to underline that when it comes to what we call risk management measures, that means that when we are adopting some measures that put limits to or even bans the use of chemical substances, it is always based on a risk-based assessment. An example of where legislation acts based on hazard is the CLP requirements, because that is a scientific process which is based on the intrinsic properties of the substance. But by and large, every legislation that otherwise regulates the risk management part of it is inherently a risk-based approach.
Okay, and Nick, from an industry perspective, how do you distinguish between hazard and risk when assessing a chemical safety?
So the real challenge here is that it's not so much about us distinguishing, it's that these are two kind of intrinsically linked things. So first off, risk is a construct from hazard and exposure. So, safety. You could also look at a positive thing, your chance of winning the lottery. That's a positive risk, as it were. So risk is the outcome of two factors, one of which is hazard. So we don't distinguish between them, but we do actually use these things differently. Hazard can be used is a very effective tool, assuming it's done well, to prioritize and focus in. So, for example, if you have an array of products that are placed on the market to consumers, you would like them to be obviously safe and therefore not highly hazardous. So if you identify something that has that, then that's a way to zoom in and say, right, we need to do something about this. But when we talk about managing our portfolio and making sure, obviously it's more risk-based, which is, then we're understanding uses, exposure, and bringing that into play. So we use both elements, but we might use them differently. One has it a little bit more upstream to guide what we might want to do, and then risk is really about managing what we have out there. I also think safety, as I've said a few times during ChemCon, is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. I would also argue that this idea of risk-based is too, because when a hazard is very severe, one can argue that there should be no safe exposure level, right? And that's where we start to slip from this idea of a risk assessment where you kind of compare exposure potential hazard to come to an outcome of whether you think something is okay, to drifting towards something which is a bit more, I will say default, but I don't mean it as strict as that, but really just saying that, well, we've just deemed that something like this is unacceptable under any context, and therefore we should get rid of it. And I think that's where there's almost a little bit of a disconnect between what I would say the industry and the regulatory authority review, is that we would much prefer it that every single thing is looked at to the nth degree before you make a decision, but we recognize that that's a lot of work. It's a complication, if you will.
And we're looking for simplification. Like a knife-throwing act in the circus, the EU has increasingly adopted hazard-based approaches in some areas, targeting, for example, PBTs and endocrine disruptors. What are the main drivers, Henrik, behind this shift?
I would start answering this question by challenging a bit the underlying assumption here, because it is not so that with specific hazard classes that we are now shifting to a different paradigm of risk management. As I just explained beforehand, any risk management measure we introduce on the REACH is based on a risk assessment or a risk approach. My inclination is to hear your question like what we under EU law call the generic risk management approach, which allows the European Union to act based on the classification of a substance to restrict use of these substances in specific circumstances. And as we just heard Nick explain, there is a differentiation between the use in industrial settings and with normal households and consumers. And the generic risk assessment, risk management approach, is only applicable to consumers. And the underlying approach here is that when consumers are using substances and mixtures, they are inherently exposed because they are not trained as people in industrial settings are. They don't wear gloves necessarily. They don't have the protection equipment. So as a rule of approach to this in the European Union, we take the view that these type of substances should normally not be found in these types of products.
Okay, when you mentioned CLP, with the ongoing discussions on new CLP hazard classes, would the EU consider refining these classes if GHS adopts those with modified criteria, or if they are combined into existing classes like reproductive or chronic aquatic toxicity?
The European Union is devoted to international cooperation, and we are clearly interested in getting the best possible outcome of the UN GSS process. And if the UN GSS eventually were to come to a slightly different result than what we currently have adopted in the European Union, we will obviously take it into account and adjust, because the whole purpose of UN GSS is to align harmonize, it's sort of in the name.
Nick, the EU and China have more hazard-based regulations, while the US TSCA is fundamentally risk-based. For a global company like Dow, is that a heavy weight, or with a lot of practice, it's doable to manage those different regulatory approaches across the globe? And how does Dow apply hazard and risk concepts in chemical product development and lifecycle management?
It's a bit of a challenge to answer this question, perhaps in the way that I would have thought of, having just heard from Henrik how everything is obviously grounded very much in risk in Europe. So I think the core premise there is open to some debate. I would say, though, from a practitioner, that I think we have the impression that hazard has been typically more important and more impactful as a driver of regulations in both the EU and to some degree in China as well, than understanding the full use and exposure conditions. So really just to kind of level set on that. Do we like or how do we manage, I suppose, between these two regions? Well, as you said, we are a global company, so we have to comply with every regulation globally where we operate. There really is only one effective way to do it, which is to attempt to identify this kind of lowest common denominator approach. What that means practically is that, if something is hazardous, for example, it's determined to be harmonized classification as a carcinogen, we will deploy that globally, whether or not it is deemed to be in other territories. We are permitted to self-classify and such. It also factors then into our risk assessments and safety assessments of our products. We take it into account. Something doesn't stop being a carcinogen because it goes to America, right? So this is the idea of we like to interrogate and make sure that we agree. And we don't always agree. And it might not be, for example, that we disagree that something has an effect. It just might be something that we think is perhaps not as potent. And that's going to factor into how we manage it.
Okay, talking about supply chains, given the global nature of chemical supply chains, how do you see international collaboration evolving to harmonize risk assessment standards?
Well, look, and this is interesting. So it is quite fascinating that different regions do approach risk assessment or risk management in different ways. And that's because any risk decision is policy. Somebody has to decide what is okay and what is not. And that will vary from one place to another. Should we try and harmonize and improve things? Yes, honestly, anything that we can do. If nothing else, the core data. I very much like the REACH database. We use it every day as an incredible tool to understand, safety of the substances that perhaps we don't make. That's the start, and making sure that we have a strong foundation that we can start to harmonize at least the core information that leads to essentially what risk management measures or how chemicals are handled. But it's important to understand that each region has its own special nuances. And so when it comes to this risk management and risk assessment, the lack of effective, let's say, wastewater treatment in one region could profoundly impact the environmental assessment versus, say, a well-structured approach in the EU. And so we have to take that into account. So it doesn't matter how much we try to make things consistent. I think there's a lot of principles and best practices that can be harmonized. But when it comes to the on the ground, it is always going to be somewhat variable, and that's a matter that we'll have to continue to live with.
Okay, Henrik, what is your view on harmonized risk assessment standards?
Well, whether we can arrive at harmonized risk assessment standards, I think might be a very ambitious target to aim for. But we do already have a number of international bodies in place that have been established with a view to minimize the frictions or the divergences that we have, and also to share best practices and better understandings of what we do. And I like to highlight predominantly as until now the most important body for that would be the OECD work on mutual recognition of data. It's something that not all policymakers are aware of, how important actually the OECD is and have been for decades in this area. We are, in the European Union, we are very happy with how the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants is working. It's a very good example of effective global, almost global, international cooperation that includes the hazard and the risk assessment, the socioeconomic assessment leading up to the decisions, and we see that it has a quite effective harmonizing effect. It's a slow process, but I think that's inevitable in something that involves so many countries. But it's quite important. We have the Rotterdam Convention on Prior Informed Consent, which is also all about sharing data, so that particularly vulnerable countries might not have the same well-functioning governance systems or databases available, are able to take the necessary precautionary action for the most harmful or hazardous substances. So I think there are a number of platforms, some of which probably could be further utilized. There is also this new, more voluntary-based chemical, the replacement of Psychem. I've forgotten the precise name right now.
Global Framework on Chemicals.
The Global Framework of Chemicals, thank you, Nick. Yep. Which is another opportunity to exchange information. And of course, ChemCon is also an opportunity to speak directly to companies and regulators. I think it's a unique opportunity.
Thank you. Do you see the opportunities to factor in more information on use and exposure to improve decision making?
Now, this has become a little bit of a hobby of mine.
Hobby? That's good.
Having put together many a REACH dossier, and you get quite frustrated at this idea of, let's say, almost an oversimplification, and it needs to be this way because of regulatory compliance, legal certainty, of how we generate data and when we choose to generate data. And a wonderful example of this would be if I'm a manufacturer of over 100 tons, there's a certain amount of data that I'm required to have in my dossier. Could be that I sell mainly to industrial customers or almost exclusively. Could be that I'm an intermediate, but it's not strictly controlled. So I have a full dossier. One company must generate all of this data. Now, compare that to a number of smaller volume registrants of another substance who are selling into a much more greater exposure potential. So consumer use is professional, but collectively, each of them is less than 100 tons, so the data requirements that group needs to provide is lower. This idea of we should learn more about the chemicals that we are exposed to as exposure increases, and tying that to a kind of we'll say fairly arbitrary tonnage band. Now, it's much more helpful actually when you're considering on environmental exposure, but on human exposure, it's not a very good metric to understand whether you're exposed or not. The uses and how those uses lead to you being exposed is a far better way. And what we've always wanted to understand is there not a way that we can find more utility for the use of the exposure information that we provide in our dossiers and we collect at great lengths to shape a little bit what testing we need so that we can perhaps focus our efforts more where there is likely to be a greater degree of exposure than less. Opportunities to do that, I think, exist even in the current legal text, but there is a vast reluctance to engage on this. And I think the number of meetings I've been in where we've discussed things like REACH requirements, adaptations, and you get a very dissenting view of the quality of our use and exposure information, that there's always something that we've missed, that we don't want risk-based testing and so on. But there doesn't seem to be any willingness to engage on this. And my challenge is, well, if there is a problem and if there's something that we can do better, what would that be? Because we would really benefit from being able to deploy this information far more. And this is a little bit where, we start to drift into this world of hazard versus risk-based, because it's evident that we could do more on the use and exposure. It is a very complicated thing for us to do. But if that's going to help improve the overall situation, I think we are very willing to engage, and having the opportunity to do so would be wonderful.
Yeah. Can you explain, Nick, how Dow ensures safe use of substances that may be hazardous but manageable under controlled conditions?
When it comes to our products, every product that we have or product family that we have, which has let's say perhaps a certain consistent composition of substances, is subject to a risk review. So before we place them on the market, before we extend the product line to new uses, before we develop a new product, there is this process to understand what information do we need. And that goes beyond regulatory requirements, because we sell into countries where there are no chemical management regulations like REACH. It doesn't mean we don't do anything. So we have a standard global approach. We're part of responsible care, which is from the ICCA, which requires you to have product stewardship, audits and things. And we have a lab, so the laboratory that we have, although smaller now and more focused on new approach methodologies, environmental fate, predates the EPA. So we existed before they did. Many of our people who set up the lab and have continued to work in there, were the founders of the Society of Toxicology in the US. So we have quite a breadth of depth of experience in this, and we do deploy it to make sure that our products can be used safely.
Going back to hazards, there's growing interest in new approach methodologies aimed at reducing and replacing animal testing. Henrik, does the Commission see ways to limit the need for animal testing, especially for larger studies?
Well, first, there is a renewed interest and pressure in Europe to promote and bring forward new non-animal test methods. You may not know, but we have in the European Union a concept called a European Citizen Initiative, where a certain number of citizens in certain number of member states, if enough have signed a petition, they can request the Commission to look into specific subject matters. And the question of animal testing has topped the rank. I think it's the third citizen initiative we had 2 years ago. But what now happens is that the interest, the positive interest in actually seriously addressing the question of NAMs is very different from what it used to be. It's an enormous undertaking, because it's not just a matter of us sitting at our desk in the offices of the European Commission drafting that we want to promote the use of NAMs instead of in vitro test methods. We need to bring along the whole constituency of regulators in member states, in research departments, and it also stretches to the whole way that we are educating people at university today. So it's genuinely a change of perception and approach that is necessary.
So it's almost like a new approach methodology movement.
I think it's a very nice way of putting it. And so what we will do is we have promised that we will come with a roadmap in Q1 next year. It's broader than REACH. It's also a matter of looking into other regulatory test areas. But as I said, it's also a matter of looking into the whole research part, where far more animals are actually being used. Another issue with NAM is that we see that maybe the capacity to develop new NAMs exceeds the capacity to actually do the validation and the regulatory recognition of these methods. So that's another element that we need to bring up. It was actually raised this morning in the plenary session by the speaker from the Netherlands, that they have already taken initiatives to ensure that a more structural and robust way of dealing with this is considered, and it would also be part of what we call One Substance, One Assessment expert group, where we will have a dedicated subgroup that will look into this matter. So it's something that is has really arisen to the top of the priority agenda for us.
Okay, thank you. Nick, both industry and regulators see benefits and challenges in grouping chemicals. What is your view on this practice?
Grouping. It's a wonderful topic, and it's a bit like a double-edged sword. And I always say I'd rather have a sword, though, right? So the challenge with grouping is that we want to use it. So, for example, in our registrations, in our internal safety assessments, it's a very effective way to get some feel for the hazards that might be on a substance you know less about. From structure comes function. Obviously, the more you know about why something causes an effect, allows you to predict better whether something that looks similar will also have that effect. So that's the core premise. And if we present this in, for example, a registration dossier, there's a very high expectation set upon us to ensure that we justify and demonstrate exactly why we believe it's appropriate, right? So there's a duty for us to convince, right? It's fine, I believe it, but I've got to get Henrik on board, right? So that's the challenge. And we've got a wonderful guidance document. There's another one being refreshed by the OECD. We have the RAF from ECHA, which finally kind of explained in a very clear way how they interrogate it so that we can better shape our agreements.
The risk assessment framework.
Exactly, the risk assessment, the read-across assessment framework.
Sorry, yeah.
So that's the position that we find ourselves in. Now, grouping is also very attractive from an authority perspective, whether it's grouping substances that are similar or doing a group based on substances that have a particular hazard, to then make a regulatory kind of risk management approach, something like this. And we get that. We understand it. It's very clear. You look at it in terms of it's a more efficient way to get number of substances that might be problematic together. I think the challenge that we see is when read-across is rejected in a registration dossier, there's a very clear outcome. Go and do a study. And that's normally based on some degree of unacceptable or uncharacterized uncertainty. Or they just don't believe us, which is fine. But when you have it on a regulatory side, what we've struggled with is that we're not convinced that the same level of scrutiny, or I will say like a level playing field exists. So if a member state or ECHA were to group substances to say they should be classified, what we struggle with is we don't always agree. And the challenge with grouping is that the very thing that we want from it, which is to demonstrate similarity, is often not true. And very small changes in a molecule can impart quite different toxicity, and we rely on that sometimes. And so what we would like to see, because it is an incredibly useful tool, it should be deployed, but we want to make sure that there's transparency, that there is scrutiny applied in an equal way, and that there is a level playing field, that if I want to group something that's going to have a profound consequence, so I'm going to classify it, and from that there will be a regulatory measure taken. I should have to demonstrate and prove that, if that's what I'm doing. So this is really what we're asking for. We've been working within the industry association, CEFIC, on some ideas of sort of core principles that should be deployed. There's already a lot of guidance out there. It's really deploying it and making sure it's clear. And again, back to a comment I made earlier, look, the more that we're aligned with what happens, the less likely we are to complain about it. And that comes a little bit from transparency and also given the opportunity to provide more data. We complain about testing all the time, I'm sure you've heard. But fundamentally, if there's an end in mind and a clear purpose, yes, okay, we'll give you that study if it helps clarify, particularly on something that has profound consequences like a restriction or a classification. So we like it, double-edged sword. I would still rather have a sword.
Okay. A question on one substance, one assessment, Henrik, you already mentioned. Does the Commission have ideas on how to reconcile different approaches to risk assessment and management among agencies like EFSA, ECHA, etc.?
Yeah, as we speak, the legislative package on one substance, one assessment is going to be formally adopted. It was voted through with a great majority in the European Parliament, I think 2 weeks ago. And I think it's imminent that the European Council, will adopt it, and then it will be formally adopted and will enter into force. And one of the key objectives of this whole exercise is to bring order into the governance of data in the European Union, so that we increasingly can rely on available data, and that the same data can be used for different types of assessments. So what the One Substance, One Assessment package will do is that, first and foremost, it ensures that data is shared and made available. In many cases in the past, we have seen that different results have been achieved based on different data leading into the assessment. So if you can get rid of that, you have already achieved a lot. But we don't stop there. We are also asking agencies to justify themselves in case of divergent opinions, and that they do a sort of a determined effort. I don't recall the exact legal term, but they have to go back and compare notes to justify why they arrived at different conclusions. And eventually, we also have the possibility to ask ECHA then to do a harmonized classification. That would then sort of be where you will settle it. We have to acknowledge that different pieces of legislation is put in place to address different types of risk.
The public is increasingly demanding transparency and a detox of industry portfolios, Nick. How can we improve the transparency and the reproducibility of hazard and risk assessments to build public trust?
It's an interesting question, and I think that, let's say, the reproducibility aspect is less of a concern, at least in terms of we have fairly standardized approaches to how we do a risk assessment and a safety assessment, although I think probably consistency and how it's applied across, as Henrik has said, there's different agencies, they have different policy objectives, they have different thresholds for acceptable and not. But the area where we can focus on is transparency, and this is actually another hobby of mine. So one of the challenges, I know I don't want for hobbies. So the idea of transparency is an interesting one. People want to know what's out there. I would argue that once this database, and actually the ECHA-Chem database, already is a massive step forward in transparency. Where we've seen the problem is not so much necessarily that data is not out there. It is generally, I would argue, probably the vast majority of data we have on the toxicity or the hazardous properties of our chemicals are in the ECHA database. It's joining the dots and making sure it's available in the right way to the people who need it. And they have different needs. So, for example, an NGO who's in charge of protecting consumer health might be more interested in knowing whether products contain a particular substance. They might not necessarily want to know all of the information that we have on it. It could just be that. There are others, who want to be able to do their own assessment. They want to know the full compositions and so on. Now, we also provide a large amount of information directly from one level to the next level in the supply chain. So we do push it through. So there's already a lot of data that goes through. And I think the concern that people have is they're just not really sure what happens to that. Now, I think things like the digital product passport, although I would like a light version that perhaps doesn't try and solve all of the world's problems.
It's not your hobby, digital
No, it's
product.
not. That's other people. Fortunately, I have to sleep sometimes. But the idea is, this idea of trying to make sure that the right information is available to the right people to foster kind of trust in what we're doing. It's really difficult for a large company, particularly one based in the US and a big multinational, to be really transparent for several reasons. It's not because we're hiding things from you. It's because we're hiding things from our competitors who would leave us for dead if they knew how we did things. So we also need to balance this idea of intellectual property, CBI, and so on. And then there needs to be a recognition that that line does need to exist. But we're certainly not against putting information out there to increase trust. I think everyone's a bit tired of the chemophobia that we've experienced for the last 50, 60 years. And we want to get back to the point where people recognize the benefits that chemistry brings to society and that we can be trusted.
That brings me to the final question. Do you see opportunities to better alignment between regulatory expectations and industrial capabilities to manage chemical risks for society?
Yeah, I think what's really important, two elements to this is, and also firstly, I would apologize for using ethanol because fundamentally it does represent a very attainable example to illustrate a point. There are many more chemicals that we would argue could benefit from a more nuanced approach. But that said, it is about this discussion and this collaboration that's important. And I'm happy to see that actually, certainly earlier in ChemCon, there are more opportunities for us to engage, and we're not seen as the criminals that must be policed. We're rather seen a little bit more closely as a collaborating partner. Obviously, everyone wants to still have an industry. It's important that we effectively manage it. But that said, I've had a presentation earlier where, we also don't want roads that lack speed limits and enforcement. We need to be constrained. We want other companies to be constrained in the same way we are, I think is perhaps a fair way of putting it, right? It's not us, it's them. But again, I think these two elements is first off making sure that we do have these opportunities for discussion. We're not trying to cheat or bend the science in our will, but we are trying to make sure that the multi-million-dollar investments that we make aren't for naught when something gets restricted or banned in a way that doesn't really make sense to us, right? Obviously, we need to be convinced, you need to be convinced. The second is, honestly, I've heard several times, even this morning, about how important the chemical industry is. You rarely hear that outside in the public domain. If you would ask a person on the street, do you like chemicals? They're very dangerous. Why? Because that's all they hear. They don't hear about the success stories. They don't hear about how critical it is to life and existence in the world, not just the EU. Because it's too easy to tell them about all of the things that you're doing to ban or to restrict or to get rid of, or another substance has been found with this, another substance. You don't talk about all the benefits and things come. And so what I would love is if there was a way to partner to, I guess, to continue to remind people how important the industry is. In a bit more positive way. And I don't mean to sugarcoat everything and say it's all fine, don't worry, you're perfectly safe, because we recognize that there's improvements that need to happen. But it makes it a little bit more easier for us to operate when we're not seen as the bad guy and the villain, because we're the only industry. There isn't another one to back us up who can be replacing us. Well, there is, but it's somewhere else. But my point is that we are the industry, and if we want to be safer, sustainable, improving, we need to foster that relationship and not be criticized too heavily.
First, I would like to come back to Nick's last point. In fact, if you look into any communication that we have issued, most lately the Chemical Industry Action Plan, a very important entry part of that communication is always to explain how important the chemical industry is for the European economy. We don't concern us so much about the whole global economy, but for European perspective, the chemical industry is absolutely essential for many good reasons. So we're trying the best we can always to communicate the essence of that, and we also see again a very strong need for that industry to be very strongly based in Europe, because we still believe that is the best way of ensuring growth and jobs, but also an interest in developing safe and sustainable by design chemicals. For that, you need a strong industrial base even. I can see the public perception issue. I think that is probably very difficult to go against. But I think what we discussed about transparency and so on are the measures that we have at hand that can help us to mitigate it. But I think there are certain things which just are difficult in the public narrative to deal with. As I explained also earlier in our discussion, we are very interested in discussing with sort of everyone, all stakeholders, including industry, particularly industry, the regulatory roadmap, so that industry is better informed earlier in the process about what is coming up. So also they can take the necessary business decisions, can start necessary investigations and so on. So I think that's an area where we definitely would see more communication between regulators and stakeholders to the benefit, hopefully, of a more efficient regulatory system that can help us better prioritize, and also industry to have longer transition times if that is going to be the result.
Henrik and Nick, thank you both for sharing your valuable perspectives. It's clear that for industry and regulators alike, finding the right balance between hazard and risk is truly a delicate balancing act, much like walking on a tightrope.